in our discussion of chapter 11. And in verse 35 it says, "And some of them understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for the time appointed." Notice that most of the things that Daniel has been talking about over the last several prophecies has to do with a period of time when God's people are going to be tried, because there are individuals who are not going to do what God would have them to do. They're not going to be of the right character. They're not going to be doing God's will, and therefore some are going to be purged, as it were, and so those individuals who would be counted, shall we say, counted worthy, would come through. But those individuals who had not prepared themselves, had not been counted worthy by their works, by doing God's will, by studying, by obedience, were not going to make it through. And but it's always been that way, has it not? We see that in the New Testament, and we see that in the Old Testament. And so we learn now, these times, from those times, and God continues to teach us from these lessons of the Old Testament that we have to be prepared. These things happen over and over and over again. Those that are prepared will make it, and those who are not prepared are not going to make it. And we can show the parables, of the wise virgins and the unwise virgins, and those who prepared their lamps, those who did not prepare their lamps. We could go on and on and on and talk about these types of things. They're talked about in symbolic language, but the end of all of it is simply that God expects us as His people to prepare ourselves to do those things He has told us to do. He has given us the tools that we need in order to make it, to preserve, to make it through. But those who do not, by just because you think, well, I was born in the church, I'm going to make it. I was born a Jew, I'm going to make it. That is not going to get you through it. So we have things we have to do. We have things that we must prepare. And so this is the type of language, in this prophetic language, in this symbolic language we see here in verse 35. This is exactly what we see here being talked about. Now as we go on, and we have mentioned from the beginning that we've been talking about the kings of the north and the kings of the south being that of the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid kingdoms. Now as we get into the last few verses, verses 36 through the end of the chapter, there is a little more controversy about who the individuals are being talked about. Personally, I believe we're still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and the persecution that fell underneath him. But I really don't really care who it is that we're talking about. The message or the lesson is always the same, which I just explained to you. That God's people will be persecuted. Those that are prepared will make it through. And that's what we'll see as we talk, as we finish this. And as we finish it, I'll give you a few examples of what some people say they think some of it is and what they don't, and I'll leave the rest of that to you, because I think truly the true message to all of that is that we must prepare, we must do God's will, and if we're not prepared, we will not make it through. I think that's truly, to boil it all down, as the saying is, that is the message. Okay, in verse 36 it talks about a king will do according to his will and exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the indignation shall be accomplished. Again, he's talking about God's people are going to be persecuted. The indignation is going to be accomplished. For that which is determined shall be done. So this is already set in stone. God has already foreseen it, see. And it's not so much that God is going to cause it, as some people would say. It's that God has already foreseen these things, and therefore we know it's going to happen. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Okay, so his desires are a little different than other individuals, and we know this if you are a person that watches what drives certain men. Some men are driven by money. Some men are driven, and women too. When I say men, I just mean mankind. Are driven by power. Some people are driven by greed. It doesn't matter what it is they're getting, cars or new suits or new clothes or new shoes for some people. I don't understand shoes, but certain individuals in certain houses seem to need an extra lot of shoes. But not that there's anything wrong with that, but certain things drive certain people, and some of those drives can become very evil. And that's what we're seeing here. He didn't certain desires, whether it be of women. We saw Solomon fall because of his desire for women, and he let women their thoughts and pull him away from the God of heaven. And we can't allow anything. We must put God first, and then our family and other things must be second. We have to keep our priorities straight, and that's the problem with our government. That's the problem with our whole nation now, is they don't have priorities straight. And when you don't have priorities straight, everything goes out of whack. Everything. And so this individual is just a despot. I mean, I don't know what else to call him. All right, verse 38, and his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and the God whom his fathers knew not, he shall honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. So he's going to use all kinds of things in order to get what he wants.
Here's me looking at these verses that this king or whoever this individual is, I guess king, or whatever his name is not really but he's not really interested in a lot of things that other people are. It seems like the only thing that really interests him is the power of war, the forces, it says right there.
Mm-hmm.
He shall honor the God of forces. He likes war, he likes power in that regard, but he doesn't desire women, God, any other gods, or any other things that a lot of people are like. Whatever. It seems like there's just one thing really that drives this guy.
Right. And I think that's that's exactly what we're seeing. He has things that is driving him, but it's insatiable. He can't be placated. You see, in his life, it doesn't bring him peace. It doesn't bring him happiness. It doesn't bring him any respite. Okay. All right, verse 40, and at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come up against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. And he shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief children of Ammon. And he shall stretch forth his hand, and also unto the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly take away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So here we find this individual that's fighting. He's fighting with a bunch of individuals and everything. He just seems to be a furious type of individual. And in many ways, from what I've read about Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, this easily describes Antiochus. He was just a furious individual that slaughtered many individuals and just went to war with everyone. And eventually he came to his own end by disease. Nobody killed him. He from the things I have read, he came to a pretty horrible end, because the disease he had evidently caused his belly to swell up to the point that it literally burst open, and he died in this way. So it had to be not only a painful death, but it's one that you would consider, that anyone would consider not the way that you would want to go, you know. So absolutely no one could help him. This is, and this is the way I see, you know, I see it as a recounting of all of the evil of Antiochus Epiphanes, and those individuals that put their lot in with Antiochus. And you got to remember, there's a lot of Jews that threw their lot in with Antiochus, and they fell with him. And so that's the way that I see it. Now, you got to understand that there are a great many individuals that say, beginning at verse 36, it jumps to other individuals. Some people say it jumps to Herod the Great, and then other individuals say that it jumps to a Roman individual, which would be most likely that of being Pompey. And that doesn't make sense to me. I want you to understand that in this type of prophetic language, it is possible for you to jump large sections. You don't necessarily go from one person to the next person, or from this day to the next day. You can jump hundreds, or even, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years from one sentence to the next sentence. That's the nature of prophecy. But it doesn't seem to make sense when you read this. It doesn't seem to make sense. Again, jumping to Rome, I understand why they would say that. I've read quite a bit, studied a little bit about that, because he's talking about down here in verse 41, him taking over the Ethiopians and the Libyans, and there's some that contend that Antiochus Epiphanes never had any control over those individuals. Well, I'm not sure that, I can't argue one way or another on that, because I don't have a great deal of study in that portion of history. I also know that some of that portion of history is a little bit spotty. So it's possible that maybe he did and they just don't know it yet. But I'm not going to argue it one way or another. I just want you to know that there are some arguments about it. Now, of course, I want you also to understand that the premillennials will say that this is the Antichrist. And of course, we know that is, this of course is not the Antichrist, because, well, premillennialism is, we've already talked about premillennialism, and this is not taught in the book of Daniel at all, nor is it taught anywhere in Scripture. But I just want you to understand that premillennialists will jump to that and say that this is the Antichrist at this point too. So anyway, unless you have other questions or other things about that, I'm going to move on into chapter 12, and we'll talk about that. But it's my thought that it is probably Antiochus Epiphanes, but I'm not going to argue with a bunch of other people, because I don't think it's that important. As I stated before, I think the most important part of it is that it is the overcoming of the warning to overcome and to be faithful to God is really what is being taught here. All right. If nothing else, as we begin chapter 12, now I want you to understand that chapter 12 is a continuation of, man has put these chapters in, so chapter 12 is just a continuation. We haven't stopped from chapter 11. I'm going to do things a little differently, partially because of time allowance and partially because of the way this chapter reads. And I'm going to read the first 4 verses, and then we'll discuss those, and that will probably be this week, and we'll take the rest of chapter 12 next week. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has never since there was a nation, even until that time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that are wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. For many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Okay. Now, if we continue the thought that we were talking about in chapter 11, we see in this prophetic language, this symbolic language, Michael stands up because now there's this great time of trouble. And so we see this conflict again. So he talks about this conflict, and he mentions that this conflict is greater than there has ever been. never, such as never since there was a nation, even unto that same time. Have we ever heard that type of statement before? If you look in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus makes the exact same statement about 70 AD. Okay, there's several other times that this exact statement is made about other times, about other events. If it was a literal statement, if it literally meant this was the worst time that has ever happened in the world, could they all be true? No. So it is obviously a symbolic statement that means something, correct? It's a symbolic statement to talk about the terribleness of a particular situation. The events at 70 AD was a terrible situation. God had brought great retribution upon his people in 70 AD in Matthew chapter 24. This is exactly what is being spoken about here. There is a time of retribution. There's a time of pain and suffering. There's a time of accountability or things of this nature that was going to come on God's people, and it was going to be a bad time. This was not going to be an easy time. And so they are being warned in a sense. We are being warned in a sense that there's difficult times ahead, and so this prophetic type language, this symbolic type language, is not meaning precisely this is the worst time that ever happened ever. It means that this is a difficult time. This is persecution that's going to come upon God's people, and they're going to have to endure through this time. God is, and it's going to come upon them. So, all right. Now, as you read the latter part of this verse, he says, "At that time thy people shall be delivered." So some people are going to be delivered. What people are going to be delivered? Those that are written in the book. Have you ever heard that phrase before? In the book of Revelation, the books are open, and those individuals that are written in the book. Now, do you think on the last day there's actual books that are going to be opened up? Or is that symbolic language to talk about the fact that there's individuals that are obedient and God knows their name? And there's also individuals that have not been obedient and God also knows their deeds. We can't get away from the fact that these things are known by God. God knows these things. He is omniscient. They are written, as it were, in the book. And that's why it is so important for us to be washed in the blood of the Lamb and have our sins, what is it? Blotted out, so our sins are not written in that book. It's symbolic for us. It's in symbolic language so that we understand the importance of those things. Those things are written down. They are inscribed, as it were, in stone, in the tablets of stone that Moses brought down. They are inscribed. And if we don't want those sins to be held against us on that last day, we want those sins blotted out of the book, right? And we want to make certain that our name is written in the Lamb's book of life. Right? So there's importance here. There's great importance. There's a great stress on these individuals that was going to go through this time of trial. All right, in verse 2, it talks about many of them that sleep in the dust. They are asleep in the dust. Who's asleep in the dust? I suggest to you, these are Jews that are not doing what is correct. These are wayward Jews. They're asleep. They're dead in their sins, as it were. And they need to awake. There's two ways of looking at these verses that talks about this resurrection. Okay? And I don't find anyone what's the right word here? I don't think it's sinful or you're not thinking spiritually not correctly if you take either one of these two camps, because there are good brethren that will fall in either one of these two camps, and they do so quite vigorously, shall I say. One of the camps will say this is talking about the resurrection. It's talking about when the resurrection, when Christ comes again and we all rise at the final resurrection. And this is what he is talking about. And but I don't believe this is exactly what he is talking about. Now, let me preface my statement by saying this. If there is not a resurrection of the dead, then no matter what we talk about, doesn't make sense at all. There has to be a resurrection of the dead, otherwise these statements are foolish statements. You know, we might as well be talking about Star Wars or some other foolishness that is just a fantasy. The Sadducees of Christ's era should have realized there was a resurrection of the dead. There is proof in the Old Testament that there's a resurrection of the dead. And these verses help prove that. Okay? There has to be a resurrection of the dead. Okay? This statement would mean, these verses would mean nothing if there wasn't a resurrection of the dead. Okay, if it was impossible for the dead to be raised, this would mean nothing. Okay. All right, but what I believe Daniel is being taught here, or what is being talked about here, is exactly what we read when we read in Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones. He's talking about Ezekiel was told in chapter 37, there was a valley of dry bones, and there were many bones in the valley, and he was told in verse 3, can these bones live? And he said, Lord, only thou knowest. He says, prophesy to these bones, and let thy bones hear the word of the Lord. Okay, what did that all mean? Well, in verse 10 he says, "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and there lived and stood up upon their feet an exceeding great army." Okay, we all know about or most of us have read a little bit about the valley of dry bones, and it's standing up, all right? Well, what this prophecy meant, as you go down in verse 12, was, "Thus saith the Lord God, behold, my people, I will open up your graves and cause you to come out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel." So one part, and I think there's a twofold meaning to the valley of dry bones, by the way. One part of this was the fact that God was telling Ezekiel, or telling the children of Israel through Ezekiel, that he was going to return them to the land of Canaan, that they were dead in their captivity, but he was going to raise them up. They may have considered themselves dead, and they were dead in the fact that they were not obedient to God. That was the reason why they were in the situation they were in. But God was going to raise them up. But they had to listen to the prophecy. They had to listen to the prophet. And then God then could raise an exceeding great army. Okay? And I believe that's part of what he was talking about. Now, if we go down in verse 21, he says, "Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whither they be gone. I will gather them on every side and bring them into their own land." So he's telling them, I'm going to take you from wherever you were. He's not just talking about from Babylon. It wasn't just Israel that went back. It wasn't just Judah that went back. It was all of Israel that would go back, that would be obedient to God. And they went back home. All right. And if you read 22 and 22 through 24, there's some talk there about the Messiah. So there's a dual portion of what the Valley of Dry Bones is talking about here. Okay, so if we jump back to chapter 12, what I believe he is talking about here is he is talking about he's going to raise them up out of Babylon and send them back back to Jerusalem. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think that. One, he has been talking in great detail and in great prophetic language for the last two chapters. How is it that he would jump from all of a sudden talking in prophetic language to all of a sudden talking about the real resurrection? That doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it makes sense to you. Now, there is no, like I said, there is no doctrinal problem with you seeing it either way. I don't have any problem with anyone that has, if you see it either way, I'm not going to have any doctrinal issue with you, because either one is doctrinally fine. But it doesn't make sense to me that Daniel is talking about using all of this prophetic language and symbolic language, and all of a sudden now he's talking about something literal. That doesn't make sense to me. And then he'll go right back into something prophetic here in just another few verses. That does not make sense to me. So, anyway, that's the way I see it. You take it for however you want to, but what we know for sure is it doesn't mean, as the premillennialists want to, that is not talking about the I'm sorry? Well, no, not the Antichrist, but the I'll think of it any moment. It'll hit me like a bolt of lightning. The rapture, thank you. That was the term I was trying to find. They will try to make this to mean the rapture, and it's obviously not talking about the rapture. All right, I have run over my time. Please, if you have any questions about that, I'm more than willing and want to discuss that with you, but our time is out tonight. Write your questions.